Welcome everyone to, whoops, we've got that all important announcements, reporting in progress. Okay, got it. So let's get underway. Welcome everyone to this event on transit and transshipment, lessons learned from the Arms Trade Treaty and weapons of mass destruction instruments. My name is Hine-Wai Loose and I lead the work of Control Arms in Geneva. Control Arms is a global coalition that works to bring about the rigorous regulation of the conventional arms trade and is focused on implementation of the Arms Trade Treaty. Thanks very much to everyone who has joined us today, especially those who have given up the opportunity to enjoy a free sandwich at an in-person event taking place in the margins of the Ninth Review Conference of the Biological Weapons Convention in Geneva. This event, of course, is very much a bring your own sandwich. Two other points about this event is that it is being recorded and the recording will be made available on the Control Arms website. Also, if members of the audience have questions, please post these in the question and answer function. Today's event is an opportunity to hear from an impressive lineup of experts and discuss what is one of the more technical aspects of the Arms Trade Treaty, and that is the transit and transshipment of weapons. When listening to this discussion, it is important to understand that under the Arms Trade Treaty, transit is the transport of weapons and materials through a territory where the items remain on board the original means of transport. Whereas transshipment differs in that the transported goods are unloaded from one means of transport and loaded onto another means of transport. The transit and transshipment of weapons, essentially the movement of weapons, is a point at which these items can be vulnerable to diversion. However, transit and transshipment can also be an opportunity to identify and interdict suspect consignments. So it's both a risk, a vulnerability, but also an opportunity. And to explain why we are holding this event in the margins of the Ninth Review Conference of the Biological Weapons Convention, and why we are looking at transit and transshipment from the perspectives of both the Arms Trade Treaty and weapons of mass destruction instruments, I wish to hand over to my much valued partner in crime, Scott Spence. Over to you, Scott. And you're muted.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, and thanks for the introduction, Hine-Wai. And it's been a pleasure working with Hine-Wai to organize this important event. We actually met this summer and started talking about how the ATT and WMD communities don't often talk to each other. Having attended the ATT CSP Conference of States Parties this summer, I saw that in person and also at the Biological Review Conference, Biological Weapons Convention Review Conference, I'm seeing that again, where the discussions on transit and transshipment, export control generally just tend to be siloed. So Hine-Wai and I had the objective of trying to break up these silos a bit and bring different communities together for a fulsome discussion on transit and transshipment. Just very briefly, I was the US expert for the 1540 committee through the end of June and have finished working there, but still remain obviously very interested in the work of the 1540 committee and was pleased to see that there is a new resolution which extends the mandate of the committee for an additional 2 years. Today we have a number of speakers with us from representing the government of Zambia, also the Flemish Peace Institute, Pontica Group, as well as a former diplomat with Zimbabwe who's now working at the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation in Washington, D.C. So we have quite a lineup of speakers, and we think that you will enjoy the program very much. So Hine-Wai, if you want to resume introducing our speakers, and we can get this underway.
Yeah, thanks very much, Scott. And just, Scott's set out the diversity of speakers that we have. I just want to explain that essentially this event is going to be conducted in two parts. First, I will introduce the two speakers speaking on transit and transshipment from the perspective of the Arms Trade Treaty. The second set of speakers will be introduced by Scott, and they will set out the experience on addressing transit and transshipment under the relevant weapons of mass destruction instruments. Although I should note, Nomsa Ndongwe, who has previously served as a diplomat here in Geneva, will speak on both the ATT and WMD instruments, and we'll really start to pull it together. And then there will be a discussion, and this will be led by Michael Beck. So that's when any questions that you pose will be responded to. Now, we've already mentioned the BWC review conference that's taking place in Geneva this week, and diplomats attending that review conference are facing a challenging time. In contrast, there has been good news for the ATT community. Last Friday, Andorra became the 113th state party to the Arms Trade Treaty. Now, I want to take this opportunity to congratulate the government of Andorra on taking this important step towards preventing the human suffering caused by the illicit trade in conventional weapons. And somebody who will be a familiar figure to the ATT community is the first speaker, and that is Mr. Diederick Cops, who works at the Flemish Peace Institute. Diederick is the leading expert on transit and transshipment, and earlier this year co-authored a report titled Under the Radar: Transit of Military Goods, from Licensing to Control, which I highly recommend reading. This report sets out a comprehensive assessment of how a group of European states are implementing the ATT's transit and transshipment obligations. Diederick is going to outline the obligations on transit and transshipment under the ATT and what are the key requirements states parties must fulfill to be in compliance with those obligations. Diederick, over to you.
Thank you, Hine-Wai, and let me start by thanking both Hine-Wai and Scott for the organization of this very useful event, very topical event, and for also giving me the opportunity to share us some insights of the recent report that Hine-Wai already mentioned on the issue of transit controls. And although my research and the study focuses specifically on conventional weapons, I think, and this is also, I think, one of the main reasons and the important reasons behind this webinar, is that there are some insights and conclusions that drawn from that research on transit of military items could also be relevant regarding the control on the international trade and transit of strategic goods more in general, and thus also of goods that could be used for the use, the development, the production, and delivery of biological weapons. So I hope some of the key implementation elements in the ATT, but also some of the challenges that I will mention regarding the difficulties implementing efficient and effective transit controls on military items will also have some kind of a relevance to implementing transit controls on other strategic goods. And although there are some important elements and some important differences between military items, conventional military items on the one hand, and dual use goods on the other hand, there are of course some important similarities that substantiate the case of drawing lessons from ATT requirements and ATT experiences in conventional weapons transit controls regarding also more strategic and dual use goods. As we look at the general aims, to a certain extent, they are similar. They both try to avoid the diversion of goods to unauthorized end users and end users by securing the legal trade of these goods and by identifying and stopping illicit traffic. And also when you look at the organization of the control systems, it's only organized on a national level based on a licensing system of a set of predetermined goods and a list of goods. So there are some similarities both in the general aims, but also in the practical organization of how these systems work and how these controls needs to be organized that can result in some important lessons that could be drawn that are similar to both conventional and dual use transit controls. And as Hine-Wai already mentioned, transit hubs are becoming increasingly important in the international trade because the trade both in conventional weapons and conventional military items and in dual use goods use general trade flows. And in these general trade flows, transit hubs are becoming increasingly apparent, and trade is running through much more transit hubs as it was previously. And while these transit hubs are particularly vulnerable to diversion, and goods are tending to be diverted using these transit hubs at the same time offer unique opportunities to secure the legal arms trade, but also at the same time to stop and to identify illicit trafficking, and also to enforce sanction regimes and UN arms embargoes. So let me first try to come to the first question that Hine-Wai asked, and is what are the key requirements of states parties to the ATT regarding transit? And it is interesting to see that there is indeed in the ATT an explicit article referring to the issue of transit, which is Article 9, which obliges member states, when feasible, to foresee in controlling the transit of conventional military items. So there is indeed a very specific item in that on the ATT. However, and this is interesting, Article 9 does not give further substantive guidance on any concrete measure that they should take, or any concrete transit or transshipment situations they must address. And this is interesting because that makes it difficult for state parties to really know what they have to do, what they need to control, and how they should do it based on the information that's included in that article. And this basically also, and I will come back a little bit later in my presentation, this first intervention, this basically reflects kind of the historically low attention that's been given to the issue of transit. However, interestingly, this Article 9 of the ATT needs to be read in accordation or together with other requirements of the treaty, and to get a better understanding of what states' obligations are under the ATT regarding the controls on the transit of military items. And important there is that there is an implementation Article 2, which foresees some kind of references to what states need to do regarding transit. And there it is included in the broad term of arms transfers, which not only refers to export and import, but also to transit. And when we look at the concept of arms transfers and how the obligations of states are included in the rest of the Arms Trade Treaty, some important elements could be discerned regarding the obligations of states parties under the ATT. Importantly, one important element there regarding the substance of control systems regarding transit of states parties is that states parties cannot authorize any transfer, not only export or import, but also not of transit or transshipment of conventional arms, ammunitions, munitions, and parts and components if the importing state or the end user is under a Security Council arms embargo, or if that state has knowledge that the goods would be used for grave breaches of the Geneva Convention, commission of war crimes, of genocide, or crimes against humanity. So the provisions under Article 6, which foresees the prohibitions of an arms transfer taking place, is also applying fully for transit transactions. So as a consequence, at a minimum, states parties need to foresee and must ensure that their national control systems give them the ability to prevent the transit of transshipment of conventional military items in these circumstances. And this implies that they need to foresee legal provisions, that their national control system needs to foresee in their legal framework the legal provisions and the legal possibility to allow the appropriate agencies to identify, to analyze, to control, to stop, and to interdict such goods transiting over their territory when they have that information available. And that's an important element. That means that states parties need to be able to control transit transactions to make sure that these goods will not be used in breaches of UN Security Council arms embargoes and the other elements that I mentioned before. Also, and this is the second element, states parties are obliged to take the appropriate measures concerning transit and transshipment to prevent the diversion of goods on their territory of conventional weapons, and to cooperate and exchange information with other states parties involved in the transfer, so the exporting and the importing states, and maybe also the other transit states, in order to mitigate the risk of diversion. So in other words, there is an obligation for states to foresee in the possibilities to share information, to cooperate with the other states parties, to share information on the transfer that's taking place to avoid diversion. But however, there is still a lack of really good guidance and clear measures that these states could in effect take to make that implementation of these provisions in reality work and to be effective. And that's important. So the ATT foresees indeed some very concrete and explicit obligations for states parties regarding the controls on transit, but on the other hand, it's still not that self-evident or even difficult for states parties to really implement and practice efficient and effective transit controls. And let me therefore end my first intervention with some of the challenges that are in play and that make it very difficult and really challenging, so to say, to efficiently and effectively implement such transit controls, not only on conventional military items, but given the similarities with strategic goods control in general, these challenges will also hold when implementing transit controls on dual-use goods and other strategic goods. And the first important challenge is the fact that traditionally, much less attention has been given to the issue of transit controls than has been given to export controls. And this is not only the case in export control systems with licensing authorities, but also within customs authorities and law enforcement agencies. And this firstly can be seen in the fact that transit control is often treated as some kind of an appendix to export control regulations, where although these systems often have a very broad legal framework, a lot of extensive legal frameworks, especially in, let's say, the more mature export control systems, transit is often very little and only a very small part of that legal framework, with little consideration being given to the coherence, the feasibility, the clarity of the legal framework. Even in several countries, even in Europe, where we've done the analysis of, do not have clear legal frameworks and explicit legal frameworks on what transit is, how they implement these transit controls, or even don't have readily accessible information on how they organize these transit controls, or even in some cases, even in more extreme cases, there's no information available on who to contact if you want to apply for a transit license, or even if you want to know information on when a transit license should be acquired. And the second element that refers to that appendix is that the information that's available to identify targeted transactions, which is basically customs information, customs declarations, which is basically the main instrument that could be used to identify the targeted transactions, both for military and dual-use goods, is that information base is in reality too limited to effectively and efficiently identify the targeted transactions. And although here is a possibility in the sense that customs declarations and customs procedures needs to be fulfilled in most cases when goods are transiting through a territory, the information that needs to be submitted in these declarations is too limited and not even relevant enough to identify in an efficient and effective manner these targeted transactions. And this basically is a consequence of the fact that customs traditionally focuses more on collecting revenues than on securing the international trade flows. And here lies an important challenge in getting the right mindset, getting the understanding of the relevance of customs, also in securing the international trade in general, but in controlling the international arms trade more in particular. And a second important challenge that I would like to mention here is that in comparison to export and import actions, in the context of transit, a new type of actor is involved, namely the international transport and logistics services providers. And these are very specific, they play a very specific role and are completely different from the traditional actors that we look at when we look at the arms trade. They're not manufacturers, they don't have the technical expertise on the goods they're transporting. They're dependent on the information that is provided to them by manufacturers or exporters. When the goods are containerized, have no physical overview of the goods that they're effectively transporting. They're often internationally organized and not always located in the specific countries of transit. And there are different profiles, with each having a very specific role in that international supply chain. And that thus makes it very difficult for them to really understand what the legal obligations are at the national level in the different countries that the goods are transiting through. And that basically, that's my last important challenge I would like to mention. That's the more fundamental one, is that it reflects the biggest challenge in the sense that we're trying to regulate an inherently international phenomenon with a national perspective. We're looking at a horizontal or transversal phenomenon, namely the international trade and international trade flows, and we want to regulate it, control it with a vertical silo approach at the national level. And that makes it difficult because the high complexity and the high divergence between how countries nowadays organize and control the transit and organize nationals approaches and systems on transit controls, the lack of transparent information on how these systems work makes cooperation between all the different actors involved in the international arms trade, be it transporters, be it customs officials, and be it licensing authorities, makes flawless and seamless cooperation and information exchange completely difficult. While at the same time, that efficient information sharing and cooperation between all these actors is crucial if we want to have an efficient possibility to control the international trade in military items. And this is difficult because of bureaucratic reasons, political reasons, technical reasons, practical reasons whatsoever. But a more internationalized approach to controlling the transit is crucial if we want to have an efficient and effective control system on the transit of both military items and dual-use items at the same time. So I will leave it at here with my first opening statements. Of course, there are some important measures that could be taken to overcome these challenges, but that's sometimes something that we can maybe take up further on in the side event. So back to you, Hine-Wai.
Yeah, thanks very much, Diederick. And you outlined some really important points, and one point you made very strongly is that export controls have received far more attention than transit and transshipment, and transit and transshipment has not received the attention that it really both deserves and needs under the ATT, and that it was excellent how you outlined the challenges, especially the range of actors involved in transit and transshipment, and that these are actors that in the conventional weapons community are just not our traditional partners, and that this is a huge phenomenon that we are dealing with. So on to our next speaker, and that is Ms. Chileshe Nkole, who is the first secretary at the permanent mission of Zambia here in Geneva. Chileshe is responsible for leading Zambia's advocacy in the areas of disarmament and arms control, and also on humanitarian issues. So this is really a broad portfolio. Specifically on conventional weapons, Zambia has been very much a proactive and engaged state. And this is demonstrated by the fact that Chileshe has served as an office holder under the Convention on Cluster Munitions and also under the Convention on the Prohibition of Anti-Personnel Mines. Today, Chileshe is going to share with us the experience of Zambia on how it is implementing the ATT's obligation on transit and transshipment and the challenges that it has encountered. So Chileshe, thanks very much for joining us at such a hectic moment in both the disarmament and humanitarian calendars, and over to you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much to both you and Scott for organizing this event. So as you said, I will give what we as Zambia have experienced in the issue regarding the issue of transit and transshipment. So as you're aware, Zambia is surrounded by 8 countries and making it mainly a transit country. So when conventional arms and other arms are transiting our country, there's always prior notification by the transiting party through our Ministry of Foreign Affairs and then to the Ministry of Defense. So the transiting request, we insist as a government, must have give us the type of arms that are being transported, the quantities, the mode of transportation, the final and original destination, the value and the dates of transiting, etc. So we want it as elaborate as we can possibly have it. So the main actors on the Zambian side are the Ministries of Defense, as I said earlier, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Customs Department, the Immigration Department, and the police. So any arms that are transiting through Zambia need a clearance, and upon presentation of the required documents, and also we need a reason for the transiting. At the entry point, the customs and immigration officers make sure that the documents match the description of the mode of transport and the cargo that is being ferried. And once this is satisfied, the truck carrying the weapons or arms is then sealed by the customs official and physically escorted by military personnel. That we insist on. They would definitely must have those in place. And so the transporter is given a specific route by the government and a time frame from point of entry to the point of exit. And we must ensure that they adhere to these specific routes and the timeframes. And this is obviously to avoid any chances of diversion of the transported arms to an undesignated place or to an undesignated end user. At the exit point, the military personnel would then hand over the transporter to the other countries' authorities once our customs has cleared the goods. So while this process from beginning to end is taking place, there's obviously information sharing between the Zambian security wings within the country. Equally, Zambia collaborates with its neighbors, especially the importing country, to verify the authenticity of the documents and the authenticity of the arms that are transiting. What is important also is that the information sharing is within the SADC protocol, the SADC protocol being the Southern Africa Development Community to which Zambia belongs. So the information sharing is within the SADC Interpol system and helps us then in identifying routes and means by which arms can be diverted. The SADC Interpol system also helps us with the list of blacklisted brokers or players in the transport system who may facilitate deviation of arms to unauthorized end users. So we highly rely on the cooperation of our neighboring countries as well as the SADC Interpol system. So this being said, we do face, it seems an easy process, straightforward, but we do have some challenges that we face during transiting of arms. And this is particularly the delay of cargo at the border. This is usually due to insufficient documentation or documentation lacking sufficient information. And this makes, obviously delays the process, makes us take a long time to clear the goods. And also sometimes it's also very difficult to obtain information from the countries that are sending the goods. And that is why as a government, we insist that documents, our government insists on documents being provided long before the shipment arrives. But another challenge is the lack of scanners at the points or at the border points. So this delays the whole process of clearing the goods. We would ideally like to have more scanners at the border points to quicken the identification of arms. The last challenge is that of the lack of knowledge by customs officers and some Zambia Revenue Authorities officials in identifying arms, especially when they're shipped in parts. We have been informed that sometimes the customs officers or the Zambia Revenue Authority officers don't know. They just think it's just, especially if they're in parts, they think it's just pins or it's just springs, and therefore that is, they will easily let these parts go without realizing that maybe we are enabling the ant trade. So for us, training of border officials in arms identification is key to avoid ant trade of weapons across our borders. And customs officials and officials from Zambia Revenue Authority need, in our opinion, to be sensitized. And we are thinking as a government to have a specialized unit that will then train and give our officers an understanding of the different parts that make up different weapons, and just to know what they should look out for. All in all, Zambia has managed the transit and transshipment of arms quite well, with very few complaints. Another thing that we are also considering as a government is to have more military personnel, like we're trying to call them military liaison officers at the borders, to help also in the identification of arms. So this is what we're looking into, and very soon I think we will have more military personnel actually operating from the borders. And I think that ends our experience. It's quite straightforward, but it has its challenges and a bit of complications here and there, but generally it's that's what we do. Thank you very much.
Chileshe, thank you very much. Yeah, I think it's really important that countries, not only European countries, but much smaller countries, especially those with less resources, share their experiences of how they are dealing with the issues of regulating transit and transshipment. And, you know, you've outlined some very practical measures. You know, first of all, understanding the reason why the weapons are being transited, and, you know, ensuring that all weapons transited through Zambia are supervised and accompanied by a military officer. And, you know, the challenges that you identify, you know, are significant challenges, and challenges that if the ATT is to be successful, that we have to get on top of and really support all ATT states parties. So thanks very much for that. I am just a reminder that, and I think one person has already done so, that if there are any questions, please post these in the chat function, and we will certainly get to them. So I now have the pleasure of handing back to Scott Spence. Back to you, Scott.
Great, thank you, Chileshe. Again, it was a really interesting overview of what's going on in Zambia, and also to Diederick for that frankly fascinating overview of transit and transshipment. I actually learned quite a bit myself, even though I've been in this field for a while. Our next speaker, we're going to sort of now shift gears since we are in the BWC RevCon. The review conference is underway as we speak. We're going to shift gears a bit and start talking about 1540 and the other WMD treaties, but specifically about transit and transshipment of weapons, controlling obviously transit and transshipments of weapons, but also of related materials. And our speaker is going to be Scott Jones. Scott is Vice President of the Pontica Group and a non-resident fellow at the Stimson Center. He has over 25 years of export control and sanctions policy and compliance experience. He previously served as the director at the University of Georgia Center for International Trade and Security, and he was a foreign affairs specialist for the National Nuclear Security Administration and Los Alamos and Oak Ridge National Laboratories. He's also served as a consultant for the Department of Defense. So Scott brings an enormous amount of experience to this topic and to our discussion, and it's a pleasure to have you with us today. So Scott, and yes, I was just going to say that you will be discussing, let me just go back to our schedule, you'll be discussing transit and transshipment of weapons and materials of proliferation concern in the context of UN Security Council Resolution 1540 and the WMD treaties. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Hine-Wai, for the invitation to speak to the group. And as most of my colleagues that have spoken so far have noted, that the transit and transshipment issue is the neglected child, if you will, of the non-proliferation space. And I think there's a very good reason for that. Some of the speakers have already alluded to this. I'll be a bit more explicit about it, which is the underlying inherent difficulty in developing a control regime to essentially manage trade flow from a transit and transshipment perspective. it's much easier to work with the fixed points in the global trading system, which are the export side and the import side. But how materials of concern move from point A to point B, or materials, generally speaking, quite frankly, move from point A to point B, introduce a range of practical and legal challenges. I think if I were to tier this from a risk perspective, I think, despite what Diederick had said, comparatively speaking, managing the trade flow in military items is a little bit easier, or I should say, from a practical and awareness perspective, as well as a juridical perspective, I think there's more structure in place. There's a greater degree of awareness as well. It's only when we ship to the so-called 1540 related materials that we encounter arguably greater abstractions in both understanding and practice. So I would just begin my remarks by noting the underlying complexity. That's not to say that this isn't an unsolvable problem, but the dual use space introduces just a range of meaty challenges that we really have to get on top of in order to address what I think are some of the underlying gaps in the treaty regimes that set the parameters for controlling weapons of mass destruction, which is namely the underlying constituent elements that go into the manufacturing of WMD, which again are dual use. So that is, I think, our prima facie challenge in this issue area as it concerns WMD. And of course, very specifically in the context of a convention like the BWTC. How do we manage trade controls in this liminal space between importing and exporting to help us meet our respective national and international obligations under such structures as Scott had mentioned, 1540, which in addition to requiring export controls also highlights the transit and transshipment element, but like to a certain extent, the ATT, it's somewhat silent on how you actually do it. Diederick had mentioned a very key term in the transit and transshipment area, which according to Article 9 requires states to develop reasonable transit and transshipment controls, which begs the question, of course, of what precisely we mean by reasonable. And I think that's left to the discretion of the state of what exactly constitutes reasonableness. So to look at this from the 30,000 foot level and work our way down to practice, I'd like to speak in terms of gaps, risks, and opportunities in the context of WMD transit and transshipment control. So in terms of gaps, I would say one of the biggest obstacles is common understanding, standards, and the application of those standards. So if we were to use the World Customs Organization as our guidepost for the canonical definitions of transit and transshipment, despite the existence of those standards, we do see in practice variations from those themes. So in terms of gaps as well, we're also looking at the adequacy of controls at the national level, as well as their enforceability. And of course, as I mentioned at the outset, I think there's this just general insufficiency of the availability of information, practical information to help states implement practical and of course reasonable transit and transshipment controls. There's also a fairly high degree of limited sharing of information in the transit and transshipment space. Customs authorities, I think, are more attuned and more practiced in sharing information with respect to exporting and importing. But again, it's this, as I described it, liminal space between sending and receiving that we have less purchase on at the moment. From a risk space, obviously, there's very high thresholds for action It's very difficult, quite frankly, to interdict shipments that are non-military, for instance, as I mentioned. Enforcing dual-use transits, as we've seen in various transit and transshipment hubs around the world, are very difficult for the reasons that we've mentioned. And I think the most obvious risk, and why we're having this discussion, is the opportunity for diversion that transit and transshipment creates. And as Diederick alluded to earlier, we also have to keep in mind the important balance we need to strike between managing and facilitation, largely because the global model that we do have, which is in the process of changing, as it always is, but the current model involves fundamentally transit and transshipment for just-in-time production. Supply chains have been disaggregated over the past 30 or 40 years, which means the international trading system relies more on the exchange of component goods, which means transit and transshipment. I think very much connected to the transit and transshipment issue, which is an entirely separate challenge, are the incorporation of free trade zones to make this transit and transshipment production, global production model actually work. And in free trade zones, for instance, there's a further diminution of customs control, which is precisely the point in having these free trade zones. But these free trade zones, which are part of global supply chains for production, again, rely on this transit and transshipment model. So there's a very high degree of risk in this format. Obviously, other risks include false or misdeclarations for dual-use goods. We see that all the time. I've certainly had many conversations with customs authorities around the world declaring their limitations in terms of their ability to recognize a misdeclared dual-use good. It's much harder to misdeclare a machine gun when you're staring at it in a container, but when you're looking at a chemical or you're looking at a piece of steel, again, the identification piece becomes infinitely more difficult. And I would say in the transit and transshipment space as well, there's an overdependence on electronic systems. There's not enough field work, so to speak, in terms of enforcement authorities getting their hands dirty, and likewise from the private sector shippers, the customs brokers, the freight forwarders. Again, there's an over-reliance on electronic systems to manage this kind of trade flow. So in terms of breaking down, and this relates to one of the challenges in terms of establishing common standards for definitions of transit and transshipment, I would argue that transit and transshipment are part of a larger area of global trade, which is beyond the exporting and importing arena. So further breaking down transit and transshipment, we have other subcategories that, again, we need to ensure everyone's literally on the same page in terms of standards and understanding. So, for example, transits can include something called freight remaining on board. We have ship-to-ship transfers, we have transportation and exportation, we have overflight, and we have for example, various definition that pertains to foreign trade zone goods. How they come in and out of free trade zones are defined differently in different countries. So sometimes a transshipment can be defined, if it involves a free trade zone, a re-export rather than a transit and transshipment, for example. So there's enough variation in the definition of transit and transshipment to introduce more cooperative complexity challenges. I also wanted to look at a couple of examples of how dual use transit and transshipment controls have been put in place. And I think this speaks to, I think, one of my final points to jump ahead a bit, which is, what do we do? How do we take advantage or create opportunities in this complex export control, or in this case, transit and transshipment control space? And I think that the bottom line here is legal flexibility, fundamentally, of beginning first principles which are legal, which is to have simply and surprisingly, this is not the case in the vast majority of jurisdictions around the world, is having that fundamental ability to interdict a shipment if you need to interdict it. Again, we have much more experience on the conventional side. We're just starting to roll out this concept and apply it to dual use, but fundamentally it's having that ability. So looking at the European Union, which operates a common or a single market for dual use goods, the regulation is, as we've seen with 1540 or Article 9 in ATT, which is just general broad guidance. The regulation of the European Union requires the member states to have transit controls for dual use goods, but how they put that in place is up to the member state, with a few exceptions that have been identified at the union level, which would be highly sensitive items. They used to be called Article 4 items, for example, and these are dual use goods that require licensing even within the single market. It's a very small list, but nevertheless, there is a common standard in Europe. Interestingly, and looking at the backstory of the whole union decision to stand up a European Union-wide export control regime for dual-use goods, looking at some of the earlier parliamentary and commission-based discussions, one report that came out of those discussions in 2006 was the following observation. Quote, due to the large volume of transit and dual-use items, systematic controls, i.e. licensing, are considered impractical and excessively burdensome. And the choice was therefore made only to resort to control if there are reasonable, there's that reasonable word again, indications of illicit proliferation. So again, conferring or devolving responsibility for policing transit in the single market to the member state. But the observation was that if we require licenses for all dual-use goods moving through the community, we'll kill the system. And I think, again, this kind of highlights this tension between practicability and the importance of maintaining the global trading system. The Dutch, looking at another case, in 2001, for example, the Dutch adopted legislation so that transit control of all strategic goods across Dutch territory became possible. Since then, the legal framework and the actual policy to transit dual-use goods has been repeatedly reviewed and revised. This is an evolving issue for many of the reasons that we discussed earlier. On the dual use side, the licensing requirement for dual use goods was eventually abandoned. So earlier iterations of the Dutch dual use transit and transshipment regime included the possibility to control everything was the initial approach, but they very quickly will only require transit and transshipment licensing on a case-by-case basis. And if you think of the port operations the Dutch run, that's a very considerable undertaking. It also highlights one of the other themes in terms of what we can do, in addition to having that sound legal basis, is establishing that the authorities, be they intelligence or customs, start sharing the information. This also speaks to the larger issue and fundamentally how this will work, be it for the Arms Trade Treaty or for the implementation of export control requirements in 1540 for transit and transshipment, is the international cooperation piece. It simply will not work. It is the legal ability, intelligence sharing, i.e. in the form of broader international cooperation. Looking at another so-called transit or transshipment economy like Singapore. Singapore has a well-established dual-use export control regime, but Singapore doesn't really export much. It is I would say, archetypal transit and transshipment economy. So from that perspective, they're acutely sensitive to striking that balance between trade facilitation and security, and have established a transit and transshipment regime that's exquisitely complex. But again, it confers a great deal of flexibility to the government and to the traders. So Singapore has mapped out a restricted and a prohibited list of goods that cannot be, number one, transit and transshipment shipped. And that would be kind of the equivalent of what I would call Annex 4 items in the European Union context for the prohibited. On the restricted side, it mostly pertains to military goods, which require licensing. For dual use goods, there's a much smaller subset of lists that actually require licensing. And there are further qualifications on that depending on how long the goods will be staying in Singapore. If those goods likewise will be undergoing any kind of processing under a certain number of days in their free trade zone. So there's a number of exemptions and qualifications in Singapore, as you would expect for a very complex economy. But bottom line is having that flexibility and customizing a regime that makes sense for the economic profile, in this case of Singapore, but for any jurisdiction for that matter. And that gets back to our definition of what is reasonable. It is all contextually driven. Looking at Malaysia next door, again, does a great deal of transit and transshipment. There are a number of conditions, for instance, for a so-called non-requirement of transit and transshipment. And again, like Singapore, these involve the use of free trade zones, or in the case of Malaysia, as they refer to them, free commercial zones. So if a dual use good is going through one of the FCZs, it depends on how long it's going to stay in the country and what it is in terms of applying some type of licensing. So again, we see this inherent flexibility conferred to the state through things such as 1540, also other guidelines that have been established by the international export control regimes. For example, the Wassenaar arrangement, which issued a best practices guidelines for transit and transshipment in 2015. Interestingly, I'll read a couple of excerpts from these guidelines. The goal of the guidelines was fundamentally to suggest to states that they establish and apply a transparent legal and regulatory system that allows, and again, the qualifying language, where appropriate, so reasonable, the authority to control items in transit and transshipment. Interestingly, it goes on to note that this legal dispensation should also include authority to extend the full activities of transit and transshipment controls to special customs areas located within the sovereign state's territory, such as free trade zones. So you see this linkage of transit and transshipment to free trade zones, which is the reality of global trade today. And interestingly, in that context, Wassenaar is the only export control related body that's addressed free trade zones in that context of transit and transshipment. So we've seen the model, in operation at the European Union level. Some of the individual states, the transit and transshipment hubs, for instance. My colleague, Dr. Beck, has been working the past few years in Panama on helping the Panamanians develop a transit and transshipment control regime. So states are starting to come online, particularly those that are arguably more relevant in this context of transit and transshipment controls. They're facing the same challenges. And again, at the global level, for the infrastructure and the guidelines, we have 1540. In the WMD space, we have some of the export control regimes that provide these standards and guidelines, but they're still of necessity generally written. We've seen, looking at proliferation history, the risks associated with the global growth of transit and transshipment, and some of the risks that economic model has introduced to our ability to control. But on the opportunity side, we've seen states carve out unique and very flexible control regimes to address this issue on the WMD side. So with that, Scott, I'll turn it back to you.
Scott, super. Thank you so much. And I think some very quick takeaways, because we still have 2 more speakers, are legal flexibility. And of course, those who are familiar with Resolution 1540, and in particular in relation to our discussion, operative paragraphs 3C and D, will understand that 1540 allows states to implement these measures as they see fit. And I think you gave excellent examples of how Singapore, the EU, and Malaysia go about doing this. Also, I picked up that identification is a major issue, and it's certainly a lot easier to identify, for example, as you pointed out, a machine gun versus chemicals or biological agents or the like. And this continues to pose a major challenge to a lot of countries. Moreover, unpacking transit and transshipment. And in fact, the variety of ways that transit and transshipment can be carried out, and the complexity of this, for example, when it takes place through free trade zones, which have popped up over the past few decades, to, as you put it, facilitate just-in-time production. But I don't want to take any longer, just to point out just a few things that I picked up on. Again, excellent, thank you so much. And so Nomsa, we're going to now switch over to Nomsa. She's going to bring all of this together for us, the experience and lessons learned on transit and transshipment across ATT and the WMD instruments. Very briefly about Nomsa, she is a research associate at the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies, a co-founder of the WCAPS West Coast chapter, and an N-Square Innovators Network fellow. She has a Master of Arts in Nonproliferation, Terrorism Studies, and Financial Crime Management from the Middlebury Institute of International Studies. Previously, she served as a diplomat for the Zimbabwe Permanent Mission to the UN in Geneva, focusing mainly on the disarmament portfolio. And indeed, she was the mission's disarmament experts for the ATT meetings of states parties from 2016 to 2018. And she has expertise in biological weapons, which is obviously quite topical for what we're going through right now with the review conference, international treaties, law, multilateralism, the non-aligned movement, and so on. So without further ado, Nomsa, over to you, please, to continue our discussion. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Scott, for that lovely introduction. Whenever you hear yourself being introduced, you're like, who's that? She sounds fancy. Thank you to Control Arms and Hine-Wai for inviting me to be a part of this panel. I want to thank all the speakers who have gone before me. I feel like in many ways, everyone has kind of touched upon, some of the things I would have wanted to talk about, which is great because I guess I can be a little bit faster and we can have a discussion sooner. I'm delighted to be here in my personal capacity and will be sharing my views, observations on my own behalf. I just wanted to make that clear. I do have the good fortune to have been deeply entrenched in the disarmament space in Geneva. And I covered everything from ATT to Conference on Disarmament to APLC. Chileshe, I'm sure you are familiar with having to wear multiple hats if you're in a small mission. I also did ITU and disaster risk. And I'm mentioning this because I do think the most important point that has been touched upon is bringing all of these different elements together. And to pardon me for, using a much abused nuclear pun, but busting down those silos of information and knowledge. So here are the points that I'm going to touch upon. I think we have an intention versus action issue, which is we have all these lovely treaties like the ATT or the CCW or Anti-Personal Landmine Convention, BWC, CWC, dual export control regimes like Wassenaar Nuclear Supplies Group or UN 1540, but it's how do we implement these things on the ground? How do we make it happen so that we are actually doing the things that countries and our glorious political leaders have decided that we care about, but we also care about just as human beings on this interesting experiment on the planet. So I think, some of these intentions are voluntary based, right? So it's like, as Scott was talking about, oh, yes, we will be reasonable. We will try our best to do X, Y, Z. And then you have some that are more stringent, like rights and obligations. And then when we talk about the export control regimes, which have received a lot of criticism, and I'm sure will be dinged in this BWC RevCon, some are exclusive in their membership. So the bottom line is we have a patchwork of intentions and legal instruments that could work if we matched those with the actual on the ground practice. I wanted to talk about the fact that, I think dual use goods are a multilateral, multitasking nightmare because, as Chileshe touched upon in some areas, how do you know what is a dual use good, or how do you know what you're looking at if you're a customs official who is at the front line of transshipment, and I guess, technically we could even argue re-export. It could be something as simple as carbon fiber, which can make tennis rackets or be used to make ballistic and cruise missiles. So I think in many regards, we did touch upon this slightly, which is in the other presentations, which is it's easier to flag a maritime shipment of grenades or a plane load of weapons than it is to identify an innocuous looking material. And we didn't really even get into the different, how there are challenges depending on what the mode of transit or transshipment is. So if it's in a plane, for example, it's gonna have different challenges than a truck at the border. Or I guess like if we're talking about, so technology is considered a dual use good, right? So if we're talking about, I don't know, let's say blueprints or drawings or photographs or instruction manuals, which, has happened in the context of, for example, DPRK and UN sanctions, who's going to know what that is necessarily? So I think, the conversation is rightfully so trying to think about, we have all these legal arrangements, some are more effective in implementation than others, but we still keep circling back to the same problem of how are we implementing these things so that it's actually going to be something that is useful and robust, which is why I'm so happy that I was invited to be a part of this conversation. And I was like, oh my goodness, when I started learning more about export controls, I was like, why has this never been connected when it comes to the ATT context, or when it comes to the UN 5040 context, on a multilateral stage when we discuss these things. So I don't know, in a way, maybe something is happening in the in the brainwaves, and y'all came up with this event. So I'm happy to be a part of it. What I wanted to say about transit, transshipment, and re-export is to say that not every member state has the capacity to deal with these challenges. And I would probably argue that no single member state is able to do all of the things well. And I think at the moment, our export controls, or even transit, transshipment, everything is sort of dependent on the exporting country, making sure that the licenses are properly awarded. And this is just if we're just talking in terms of okay, most places, I think Scott mentioned this earlier, that there are many countries, or maybe it was Diederick, many countries don't necessarily have very much going on in terms of how do they look at what a license coming from X country is saying. Does it fit in with their own harmonized laws or their national laws? So if you are just in the middle of the chain, you're like, oh, this is a export control license from the United States saying this is a thing that is being shipped, looks good to me. Like we said, you might not necessarily be able to look at inside to see what it is, or if you do look inside, you don't know what you're looking at. And I mean, unless we are having a situation where something is clearly labeled anthrax, how are you going to know that, oh, this is a biological good that is something that we should be worried about. Like, so I think it goes back to everything that everyone else was saying, which is just that, you know, you have your technical know-how that needs to be improved. So it's like what everyone else knows, what one person knows, everyone else should know, and that makes things a little bit easier. But then we also have the challenge of just, quite frankly, like, how do we prevent it from being I focus on customs, I focus on ATT, I focus on nuclear weapons. I'm talking about, you know, safeguards. How do we bring all of that already pre-existing knowledge together to sort of have people and countries working in a way that makes it easier for us to even successfully implement the things that we do have. And I wanted to comment Hine-Wai, so my background is in the law, and, you know, there's always that tension between, we have a law that says this is what we're supposed to do, and then we have what we're doing in terms of just like our own intention. So like norms, like the normative effect, right? So in many of these cases, it's also a question of good faith versus bad faith, like good faith interpretations of, oh, yes, we are trying to control dual use goods, or we're trying to control the shipment of arms and the transfer of arms, versus, well, technically our laws don't say that, or our laws are silent. So I think, you know, it's also worth bringing up that there is that angle that we should also be considering in terms of, like, not everything has to be written down to the letter of the law. It's also just about best practices and people actually, you know, doing what they say that they want to do. And that brings me to touch upon the last point I was going to make, which is the crisis of credibility in multilateralism. It ties in very well with what I was saying about best practices and saying you're going to do a thing and then doing a thing and being very rigorous and consistent in carrying that out. So I think, you know, at least in the ATT context, you know, there is an inclusion of civil society that we don't see in some of these other regimes. And when we're not bringing everyone to the table who could potentially help to make these things work, then we're going to continue to have gaps and problems and tensions that cannot necessarily be addressed easier. Whether you are a wealthier state or a developing state, I think that is going to just be what it is, which is why I did want to shout out the Philippines and their Strategic Trade Management Act for actually housing WMD obligations and ATT obligations under one umbrella. And, you know, perhaps that is a practical example of something that we could use for other countries and other regions as well. This kind of got rambly because I got very excited just listening to everyone and the points they were making. So apologies, I'm a bit of a nerd. But yeah, that's what I wanted to say at this particular juncture. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nomsa, and thank you for mentioning Philippines. I think that's right on. I've worked with them for many years myself, as have colleagues, and they now have their Strategic Trade Management Act where they bring all of this under one roof, and that works for them. And that's in the spirit of ATT, and that's in the spirit of 1540 and the other conventions where states need to figure out, with guidance as requested from the international community, how to implement this in a way that, as you put it, works well for them, doesn't leave gaps, and is fluid. So thank you very much. Now we're going to turn to Dr. Michael Beck. Mike is the president of the Panica Group. He has over 25 years of experience of working with governments to develop, implement, and enforce effective strategic trade controls on dual use and defense goods. He's worked in over 40 countries and trained several thousand officials through a strategic trade management academy that he launched when he was at the University of Georgia's Center for International Trade and Security. He's worked with numerous countries in pursuing export control legislation, most recently Chile, Panama, Jordan, Vietnam. He's also worked with numerous international companies to establish export control compliance programs. He speaks Russian and Spanish, and he got his PhD at the University of Georgia in international relations. Mike is going to, let me go back to the agenda here. Mike is going to lead the discussion on the way forward. This will include questions that he has for some of the panelists. It also will include questions from the audience, the participants. So if those of you who are listening to the panelists have questions, please put them into the chat box and Mike will pick those up. And so Mike, over to you.
Very good. Thank you, Scott. Thanks to you and Hine-Wai for bringing us together. I think this is a fantastic forum to kind of start breaking down some of the silos that Nomsa and others have mentioned that exist. And I want to ask a question to Nomsa. I'm not going to start with you. I'll probably finish with you. But one of my questions was, how do we break down these silos? You know, we have all these international institutions, obligations, and there's no single institution that brings together folks from ATT with people from the WMD non-proliferation community to say, look, we've got a common set of challenges. How do we do this in a way that most member states can actually implement these things? One of the themes that I heard from Diederick, from Scott, from you, Nomsa, is complexity. Everybody's talking about complexity. And a question that I have is, you know, how can we, you know, deal with this issue of complexity so that especially smaller states can implement and enforce these obligations on transit and transshipment controls? Some of the common challenges for both dual use and defense transit and transshipment controls is that customs organizations, as several of you noted, have other priorities. You know, they're focused on what's coming into the country that might be dangerous, what's going out, not so much worried about what's passing through unless it's especially dangerous, especially dual use transit's not a priority. No, there's been very few cases or examples that we can give of enforcement of these transit and transshipment controls for both dual use and defense goods. There have been a few exceptions. One of them mentioned in the Flemish Peace Research Institute study, which I want to suggest that everyone who's participating read. Outstanding work by Diederick and his colleagues looking at the challenges of implementing transit controls. Another case is the Chong case, I wanted to mention, from Panama, but that also highlighted some of the practical challenges of in implementing, enforcing transit and transshipment controls. You may recall that this involved a shipment of military-related goods from Cuba to North Korea, a clear violation of UN Security Council sanctions. And there was intelligence tip, which led to the Panamanians acting, identifying a hidden compartment of these weapons buried below sugar. And, you know, again, the Panamanians turned to the United Nations and said, what are we supposed to do? The UN Security Council came back to them and said, well, it's up to you to figure out what to do and to implement these via your national legislation. And, you know, Panama doesn't have any export controls, transit and transshipment controls that would allow them to effectively deal with this situation. So it highlights again the need for many countries to implement their ATT obligations, their sanctions obligations, their non-proliferation obligations. One of the things that our group, Scott Spence and I, Scott Jones, have been thinking a lot about is how do we right size export controls, transit and transshipment controls, and in general, non-proliferation and arms control obligations for developing countries who are just overwhelmed. They cannot interpret, understand, and figure out how to implement these various obligations in a meaningful way. So there needs to be an effort by the community, arms trade community, the export control, non-proliferation community, to right size these obligations. So I'd welcome thoughts from Nomsa and from the other panelists on how we do that. We've been thinking a little bit ourselves on this issue. Also wanted to note, I think Dr. Jones mentioned a few key differences between regulation of transit and transshipment controls on defense goods versus dual use. Again, I'm agree with him wholeheartedly that it's going to be much more practical to have a system to control and regulate defense transit and transshipment controls as opposed to dual use. With dual use items, we're talking about 1,800 items that are on, say, the EU control list. It's going to be very difficult to effectively monitor and regulate that trade in a meaningful way. So it's going to depend upon intelligence to effectively identify, interdict. The key thing I think Dr. Jones mentioned was the need for flexibility, having the legal authorities for states to intervene when there's information and know-how that something of proliferation concern is destined to a sanctioned or problem end user or end use. Chileshe, I'm going to start with you. I understand you're not feeling great today, and I have several questions for you as it relates to developing countries. I understand that the ATT will be in discussions on how the ATT working groups could be restructured. How do you think the ATT process could better support state parties, especially developing countries, with the implementation of their obligations on transit and transshipment? And how perhaps could the 1540 community also help states implement obligations as they relate to transit and transshipment?
Thank you, Michael. I'm so sorry. I need to apologize. I'm suffering from a terrible cold. In my opinion, I think we could consider better cooperation between the developing countries and the other countries that are a bit more developed, and encouraging the cooperation between states parties to the extent that we provide more training. I know for the biggest challenge that we have is the untrained border control officers. And if we had some training, if maybe the ATT to come up with some maybe trainer workshops within, maybe starting with the regional groupings, start with SADC, ECOWAS, and that way then it will trickle down to the countries. It's basically encouraging the awareness, the ability to examine, to identify that this is this component of this, or like Nomsa mentioned, this fiber that will be used to, it's to encourage the awareness, the knowledge. So I'm an advocate of cooperation between countries and amongst countries, but the ATT could help with maybe just by starting with maybe some training workshops, regional groups, or identify certain countries that have this biggest challenge, and then train those people that are then it would trickle down to the rest of the governments. Yeah.
Thank you. Also wanted to ask you a question. You played an important role and served as an office holder under the Convention on Anti-Personnel Mines, and I was wondering, for Zambia, how does the implementation on the Convention on anti-personnel mines compared to the Arms Trade Treaty? What's your experience on being an active state party under the two different conventions?
The implementation, of course, is different. Under the APMBC, Zambia's completed its implementation obligations and in terms of mine clearance. But with the ATT, it's ongoing. It's every day. It's evolving. It's requiring us to be aware. It's implementation on a daily basis with the border control, especially with transiting goods. So we need to be focused. We pledged to the whole world to join, the whole world in ensuring that we make the world a better place in terms of having a mine-free world, in terms of having arms control. And so we still do our part, even though with the APMBC we've finished our universalization, we've finished our implementation, but we still go ahead with the universalization of the convention, and that's what all the conventions need, is universalization, because not all countries have abide by, and in addition to what Nomsa said, we need to we pledge and we must do what we have pledged to do. And it's entirely up to us. We do our part, and we hope that the next country does its best if they see a good example, if we are a good example, that is, and they will be encouraged in that way, and that helps the whole community in controlling arms.
Thank you. It's very good. Scott Jones, you had mentioned the challenge of the free trade zones. What do you think the security communities, the ATT, the 1540 and the non-proliferation WMD community should do about the risks posed by free trade zones? Because clearly they do represent a risk area, and to my knowledge, there hasn't been significant progress made in ensuring that free trade zones do not become black holes where things are, go in, they're not regulated and are diverted to countries or programs of concern. So do you have any ideas on how to address the free trade zone issue?
Well, thanks, Mike, for the simple question. In terms of response, I think you're right. There hasn't been a lot of attention. I mentioned free trade zones again in this context of transit and transshipment, because that's the reality of the economic model that links free trade zones into global trade networks, is mostly transit and transshipment. Component goods go in, partial furnishing, partial refurbishment or production, then they transit out. We know that it has been an issue of concern for international enforcement agencies such as Interpol and to a lesser extent the World Customs Organization, but that's mostly focused on what I would call the more prosaic aspects of trade violations such as smuggling. There was a report that came out, I think about 7 years ago by the OECD that was looking at free trade zones from this use of free trade zones in a criminal capacity in trade networks, and was mostly moving things like cigarettes and alcohol. So I think as we've seen with non-proliferation, it's an evolutionary process. We began by focusing on the easiest bits, export control. Now we're moving into some of the more challenging areas such as transit and transshipment and the associated nodes in international trade such as free trade zones. Number one is as we're doing now, increasing awareness, I think is key with free trade zones. And something else we haven't mentioned, we've I think vaguely referred to who's responsible for these challenges, looking at the international organizations or treaties to really do the heavy lifting of making the trade control aspect of the system work and more effective, to limit the spread of conventional weapons, to limit the spread of weapons of mass destruction. But we really haven't talked about the private sector's responsibility in this calculation. And I think that's key because it won't work with them. Nomsa had mentioned the importance of international cooperation, getting the authorities on board, of course, is key, but likewise is getting the private sector on board, particularly in the context of transit and transshipment, where that means the logistics industry writ large. I know there's been a lot of focus recently on logistics sector with respect to a proliferation threat like North Korea, for example. A lot of focus on ship-to-ship transfers, for instance, but not of strategic items. We're talking about oil in the context of sanctions busting. But likewise, we need to elicit their support and increase their awareness of their responsibilities and their role in this space, particularly that customs brokering and freight forwarding niche, because they're really the facilitators, the moving parts of the engine in this global trade flow. I mean, they make the actual shipment happen. They are the ones that orchestrate the movement, in this liminal space. So if the good's going through Singapore or it's going through Malaysia, they need to know what those laws are. And in many cases, they don't. So I think maybe that's a focus area more broadly looking at the conventional side. It's, in addition to focusing on the defense producers, for example, we look at the kind of the feedstock facilitators on the facilitation side, and likewise with dual use. Working
Scott,
with the
one thing that it's a good point. I think Diederick's comments and his report, which again was outstanding, draws attention to the need to engage the logistics sector. And my question for Diederick, if he's back, is how can governments better ensure the cooperation and compliance of the logistics sector to ensure effective and efficient implementation of transit and transshipment controls? Should we license and only perhaps allow certain carriers and logistics providers to handle defense goods and dual use items? Are there other things that could be done? Perhaps we should require any company that's carrying arms or dual use items to have some kind of a compliance program. What practical things can be done to get the cooperation and compliance of the logistics sector?
I think that's a really good question. I think the feeling I had when talking to logistical companies was that they're willing to cooperate because they also have a stake in it, because they have to be legally compliant with all legislation, because they have an interest in being compliant. So I think there's an interest for them to cooperate. I don't think licensing only a very specific number of companies doing the transport will be effective, and that you then open ways for illicit routes around it, and that also other companies might start doing it without the proper licensing. My opinion is that there is a willingness to cooperate. I think there is a role to play for national authorities to reach out to transport companies, to let's say umbrella organizations, to set up schemes, to raise awareness, to implement internal compliance programs, which would allow to identify specific transactions by transport companies, by customs brokers, by freight forwarders, by carriers, and so on, to identify certain transactions and to know who to go to if they want to apply a license, and to really know how the system works, because that's also a big challenge, is especially for internationally organized transport companies. If they want, for example, in the EU, and they want to transport defense products, it's virtually impossible for them to know under what circumstances they can do that, because there are 27 jurisdictions with each very diverging rules. So being legally compliant in that context is virtually impossible. So I think there's an important role to play. And what I would also recommend is this, for example, within the ATT framework and the working group on transit, I think there is a necessity to include transport companies, but also transport umbrella organizations in the working group proceedings, and to really share insights and to cooperate and see what's feasible also for transport companies, for the information that they have, how that information could be used in cooperation with licensing authorities, with customs agencies, to come from an efficient identification of possible relevant transactions, and to work with them together in building these controls. And I fully agree with Scott, you need to include them. They're having the information, they're transporting the goods, so you need to cooperate with them in building an efficient and effective system.
Thank you, Diederick. I think I absolutely agree. I know governments have given quite a bit of attention to outreach to the community of exporters and manufacturers of defense and dual-use goods, but very little attention to freight forwarders and the logistics sector. It's one that most of those who work in the licensing sector don't understand international supply chains, perhaps in a way they need to. So some dialogue there would be helpful. And that kind of leads me back to kind of what I believe will be our final set of questions to Nomsa. Again, that question of silos that you brought up, I think it's you hit the nail on the head, that we have all of these silos. How do we break these down? Whose job is it to break down the silos? And how do we bring these different security communities and institutions together to right size a response and to ensure more effective and efficient controls, both export control as well as transit transshipment controls.
Wow, I feel like you might have misunderstood my participation, Mike. I was told I was here to just, illustrate problems and not provide solutions, but I will do my best. Well, at my current place of work at CNS, we do work on training the trainers, and we work on like the education element. So, Chileshe, you mentioned training the trainers, hit me up. We currently work with Southeast Asian countries and a bunch of other countries on export controls and trade compliance. So, which kind of segues into my response to your question, Mike, which is, if you recall, the original UN 1540 deeply encouraged civil society, academia to provide institutional memory and analysis. And that was mainly because, there was a recognition that government cannot do it all alone. So when we talk about busting down those silos, I mean, we rely on some of those other areas of expertise like civil society, like academia, and we get lovely people like Control Arms to connect those different places together and, start brokering or engendering some collaboration and cooperation, whether it comes to just the institutional knowledge of how did we get here, or this organization or this university is working on a pilot project to help bust down those silos. So perhaps you would like to speak to them if your country is interested. That's where I would start. I don't think we have to make it too difficult. We have Diederick here with his report that he was sharing. I think he's a prime example of someone that could be invited to talk to a country about, okay, great. So 127 pages, Diederick, like summarize them in a PowerPoint slide, and how do we, get this thing moving? In a BWC context, I know, for example, that we have, we have the mechanism to connect countries, member states with other member states or organizations on biosafety and biosecurity measures. If I recall correctly, that was a thing that happened and used to happen. And when I was in Geneva working on BWC issues, the ISU consistently reported that there were so many offers for cooperation that were just never taken. So we have a lot of things that are systems in place that we could rely on to start making the busting down of these silos feel a little bit more intuitive to member states and to organizations and to the private sector, like we spoke about. And, you talked about supply chain disruption, and I can't help but think, nothing brought that into stark relief more than the COVID-19 pandemic. And suddenly everybody had to appreciate, I guess Amazon can't deliver that mask because the company has shut down because of COVID. So I think, once again, there are probably many lessons that we can learn from partners in that space, whether it's the supply chain side or the global health side, on how they have circumvented some of those problems and issues. That's in a nutshell, that's what I would say, based on the fact that I did not come to provide solutions.
You did an excellent job there. Again, I want to thank Control Arms for bringing us all together to this is an important step in helping to break down silos. Hopefully in the next iteration, we might look to bring together some of these other actors from the logistics sector, from the free trade zone authorities and the likes, get a broader discussion going around how to more effectively and efficiently implement these controls. And one of the things that Scott Spence and I and Scott Jones are talking a lot about too is how to right size a response and develop what we would call appropriate controls for many countries in the developing world who are really struggling to implement a lot of these international obligations in a meaningful way. So if anyone's interested in joining us in that endeavor of right sizing, please be in touch with us. And with that, I think I'll turn it back over to Hine-Wai to wrap things up here.
Well, thanks very much, Mike. And I don't think we've done justice to your skills as a moderator and to your, clearly extensive knowledge in this area. I feel like this discussion could have gone on for much longer, but alas, we have to finish. And I know that many people on this call will have other meetings to go on to. So thanks very much. I want to begin by, really thanking Nomsa, Mike, the two Scots, Diederick and Chileshe, for preparing for this event and sharing their knowledge and experience with us. This is really appreciated from my side. And just to say on the one point on the ATT side, an issue that was raised a number of times is about the role of the private sector. And next year, the Republic of Korea will be the president of the Ninth Conference of States Parties to the ATT. And I understand that their thematic focus will be on the role of the industry. So that'll be an interesting discussion to join. One thing that I took very seriously, that a point made by Nomsa and that was also spoken about by Chileshe, is that we have to show good faith. We have to demonstrate that these obligations really mean something, and that action is being taken behind them. And transit and transshipment, I feel from today's discussions, I've got a better understanding of the challenges. But the work ahead is going to be long, and it will be difficult, and it really faces challenges. But we have to stay on this path. And really, speaking from my side, the ATT, it is a comprehensive treaty and its obligations are extensive. And Chileshe spoke about how, for Zambia, it's very much a work in progress. It is ongoing. And on this journey, in order to be effective, we have to really learn from other fora and from other instruments. And in this case, it is the WMD committee, to learn from their experiences and to understand what has happened. This breaking down the silos, it is an issue that we so often talk about, but do we succeed? And, I think, Nomsa, you're right. It doesn't have to be so difficult. And really, we have to get underway in this area, in the area of cooperation and assistance, making sure that the few resources that are out there to assist states are really being put to best possible use. So thanks very much to everyone who's hung on in here and joined us today. I hope people go away feeling better informed and really understanding the scope of transit and transshipment. I hope that this isn't the end of our partnership with Scott Spence and the two Scots and Mike, and Nomsa and Chileshe and Diederick. I look forward to seeing you again soon. So please do join us again in the future, where we look forward to continuing this discussion. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you, Hine-Wai. Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
And thank you, participants.
Thank you for having us.